Welcome back, everyone. This is the seventh episode in the series Tales of TR, offered by the Theodore Roosevelt Institute of Long Island University. Our speaker is Tweed Roosevelt, the great grandson of the 26th President of the United States and chairman of the newly formed Roosevelt School, which opens in fall 2021 at Long Island University here in New York. Today's episode is titled TR the Conservationist. We invite you to watch previous episodes of our speaker series by visiting our website at roosevelt.liu.edu. A recording of today's webinar will be made available on our website by the end of this week. During the presentation, feel free to type your questions into the Q&A or chat box, and we'll try to answer as many as we can toward the end of the program. It's now my great pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Professor Tweed Roosevelt.
Well, thank you very much, Rita, and welcome all my old friends that are back again. And those of you that are new, I'm delighted to see that you're joining us. It might interest you to know that over this series of 7 lectures, we've had more than 8,000 registrants. And today, you're not alone. We had for this episode, we have more than 900 registrants. So I'm very pleased in that, and that you're faithful following me. Well, today is one of my favorite subjects about TR the Conservationist. It's interesting, you know, TR would not have considered his conservation legacy as his greatest achievement. In fact, at several times he said, my greatest achievements were the U.S. building up the U.S. Navy and the Panama Canal. But I think history would disagree with him. So I'm going to delve in some depth into this very important part of his life. And I'm going to divide my talk into 2 sections. The first section will be really a description of how TR became a conservationist and how he prepared himself to be a leader in this role. And the second part of it will be about TR and what he achieved as president and at various other times. So why don't we get started here? He used to explore his father's library, and even well before he could read, he was really basically a toddler. He discovered a number of books that he really liked, books that at that point had illustrations, because I say he couldn't read. If you want to know more about TR and how he developed as a reader, and a lot of it will be about his environmental and natural science reading, you might go to the website, roosevelt.liu.edu, where you can see a previous talk I gave called TR Literary Fella, which will go into much more detail here. But let's start by saying that TR, what he would do is carry this book around. It was enough of an oddity that his sister noted it quite carefully. He'd carry this book around, and whenever he could corner an adult, he'd open up the book and point to a picture and get the adult to tell stories about the picture. And then when he got a little older and started to learn how to read, his father discovered his interest in natural science and got him going on all kinds of books, starting with kids' books and up becoming much more technical. In fact, at a young age, he read Darwin's Origin of a Species, and that, of course, shaped his life. In any case, when he was maybe 10, 11, 12, something like that, he was walking around the neighborhood. He lived in Manhattan, down in the lower part. And there was a fish store or some kind of a store, and the owner had put out on some kind of a stand the carcass of a harbor seal. And let's see, why can't I make there? I'm having trouble making this work here, folks. There we go. A harbor seal. There's an example. So here was the carcass of a harbor seal in front of a store. The guy was using it as a promotion to get people to come in, but TR was absolutely fascinated by it. He kept returning day after day, and he measured it very carefully, and he got all kinds of, you know, the length and this and that, and writing extensive notes. I love seals. To me, seals are sort of dogs that swim. And maybe that'll give you an idea about this. Well, in any case, he got the store owner, after several days, the seal became sort of ripe, as you might expect. And so he pleaded with the storekeeper to give him the head of the seal. And so he got the head and he took it home and boiled it down to get the skull. That must have really upset the cook and various other of the house staff in any case. And he wanted to put it with what he called the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History, which was a cabinet he had outside of his bedroom where he was beginning to collect all kinds of things. And as he started out, he was a very omnivorous collector. So this museum began to have insects and all kinds of things. But as time went on, he began to focus his interest on birds. And this clearly became a major interest to him. Now, I couldn't find any photograph of TR as a young man with birds. So I had to settle here with his oldest son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who was holding a parrot. In any case, he became quickly enamored with birds. And he started, his family started in summers taking him to various places to where they would, they would all run around. And he would go out to Long Island. Let me see, out to Long Island. They would go to New Jersey. They go to the Hudson Valley, and they would go up to the Adirondacks. Sometimes TR would be with them, but whenever they went in the summer, TR spent a lot of time in the woods. Now, when he was young, TR, and no one else, realized that he could see very little. He was very, very short-sighted. So the only thing he could do really was hear birds. He could hardly see them. And this was very important in his future development because since he couldn't see them, he focused really much more on the surroundings and the bird songs. To kind of understand this, imagine when you were very young, you suddenly went deaf. And your parents who loved operas took you to the opera. So you would be watching the opera, but you couldn't hear the singing. So what would you do? You would focus on looking at the scenery and the costumes, all things other than the singing. And if later on your hearing came back and you went to an opera, you of course would now hear it, but you would have been trained to look, and you probably wouldn't have even noticed it. You would look at the whole production in a different way than other people and pay attention to the surroundings. Well, that was what happened with TR. So all his life, he was interested not only in the bird sounds, but all that surrounded them. And so he started his studies, if you will, in collecting. He was given a gun quite early in life. I think he was 10-ish or so, and he'd start hunting for guns. Now, the Adirondacks had particular appeal to him, and there was a sort of a watering hole, an inn called Paul Smith's Lodge, which a lot of New Yorkers went up to and sort of get away from the city in the summer. It was a beautiful place, and TR went there frequently. In fact, he developed a love of the Adirondacks that lasted his whole life. And he would spend his time, the family would spend the time swimming or sitting around. He would spend the time collecting in the beach, collecting in the woods. So the next kind of step in his development was his family. His father and mother took all the kids to Europe several times for what were grand tours then. They lasted several months. And TR, who by this time had become a terrific note taker, and not only was he an assiduous diarist, but also he had books of notes about his outdoors or wildlife observations. And he continued, of course, through Europe. The family went to Europe and the Middle East and Africa on these long trips, and TR spent a lot of them collecting. One time they went to Egypt. Oh, I should show you, that's right. He's also started drawing birds very carefully. And this is, he's probably about 13 or 14. The drawing on the left, I think it's a watercolor. It's of a Spanish sparrow. And it was really pretty good. And you can see that because on the right, you have a photograph of a similar bird. I thought he was really doing very well at that age, although mostly he confined his work to keeping diary and notes. Well, they went to Egypt and chartered one of these boats. The way you did it in Egypt, there we are. The way you did it in Egypt was you chartered one of these. Each family would have one. There were many of them with tourists. A lot of people they knew came from New York. And you'd spend several weeks going up the Nile. And the boat would put over frequently on the side. And TR spent his time often wandering around on the banks, collecting birds and whatever else he could collect. Parents also took him to the Middle East And one of the places was Petra. Petra, if you have never been there, you should go. The rose red city, half as old as time, as the poet called it. And he collected there, amassed quite a collection. Now, on one of these trips, the parents took all the kids and placed them in a family in Germany, where they stayed for a couple of months. And the idea was that the family would teach them German language and German culture and show them all kinds of things that are German. And this was quite successful. The father was a guy named Minkwitz. And I was rather proud. This is a picture of him. I was rather proud of this because Minkwitz is the family's always mentioned in the biographies, but I've never seen a picture of him. And I managed to find this picture while researching for this talk, and I was really delighted with it. He was actually quite a prominent man. He was a member of the Reichstag, and was like a US congressman, and a prominent fellow. And this was a very successful sort of relationship that started. So next we go to Harvard. And when TR arrived at Harvard, one of the first people he met was a guy named Henry Maynard. And Henry Maynard, if anything, was a more experienced, knowledgeable birder than TR, and that's saying quite something. So they immediately bonded, and they spent much of that first year going around to various places near Cambridge and observing and collecting birds and doing general birding. Well, that summer they went up to the Adirondacks, and they spent several weeks there, and together they collected their observations, and they had them printed up. This was TR's first printed book, and each entry is a particular bird they saw, and then a brief description of whatever they noticed about that. And there were 98, I think it was, birds listed in this. So TR had it published, and interestingly, it made something of a splash, because there's a guy named Seahawk Merriam, who was perhaps the leading American naturalist of the time. He somehow got a copy of this, and he reviewed it for the birding journal of the time, and he reviewed it quite positively. So TR had rather an encouraging start on all this. We'll have a little more to say about Merriman later on. Another major thing that happened when he was in college is that TR started going up to northern Maine, where he had been put in touch with two guides. There were Dow and Merriman were the two guides, and they were young men. They were probably in their early 20s at this stage. TR was just a little bit younger, but they were extremely accomplished woodmen. They were loggers, and they added a little money by guiding people. When TR came up, they looked at him probably a little bit askance, this weedy, rather effete-looking guy. But quickly they bonded, and actually that was a bonding that lasted their whole life. So Sewell in the middle, and Wilmot on the left, they were cousins. This was important for a number of reasons, but two of the major ones is that first, TR, up until this time, there's no other way of putting it, he was a terrible snob. And when you read his writings at Harvard, letters and so on, when he's referring to people, it makes your skin crawl. He was so snobbish. And this was his first chance to really reach outside of his sheltered life and see what the rest of America was like. And he was very taken with these two and really impressed him. The other thing about this trip was it's his first real chance at big game hunting. He started up there, you could deer hunt and moose hunt, a whole bunch of other things. And TR began what was a lifelong interest in big game animals. It played a major role in his conservation efforts. So now going back to college, same time in 1878, he delivered a talk at the Nuttall Ornithological Club. There's Mr. Nuttall. This was one of the very first sort of organizations that focused on birding. And most of the members were professionals, although many of them were knowledgeable amateurs like TR. In any case, he launched himself into his first war. It was called the Sparrow Wars. And this was a big deal at the time. What had happened was some people had seen that the East Coast trees were being decimated by canker worms and caterpillars. And somebody had the idea of bringing the English sparrow over here, an invasive species, we call it now. So this bird was released and was supposed to control this problem. But, often these invasive species don't do what you want them to do. And it turned out that the bird, it ate a few canker worms, but it did much other things. It devoured lots of grain in the fields. And also it was a very aggressive bird. If you look at the male there at his face, I think you can see that the artist has put a rather aggressive, strong-mindedness into this little bird. Well, there was a huge argument about what to do about this. And there were those that thought the birds should be left alone. They were here and they were really nice. And there were those that thought they ought to be eradicated. And TR came down on the side of the eradication of them, as did most scientists at the time. And there were tremendous efforts to do it. Of course, they weren't successful. All you have to do is look out your window and you'll see English sparrows pretty much anywhere, particularly in the city. And this effort to eradicate them continued all the way when I was in prep school and involved in birding and studying birds and collecting birds and banding birds. We would kill all the English sparrows we got. Well, it was hopeless. The sparrows did far better. Well, that was the first of many battles. And I think right now I'll tell you about a couple of others battles he'd gotten involved with. One was called the Nature Fakers. The Nature Faker battle. And what that was about was, and this was during TR's presidency now, there were a bunch of natural science children book, mostly writers, who began writing stories, anthropomorphizing, in other words, making animals into kind of human characteristics, anthropomorphizing animals. And they went to great extremes. And they said this was real. That was the problem. They said this was real. They had observed birds that made casts for broken legs. And you can see the snipe on the upper right, so tending to a cast. And they had seen birds, I don't know what those are, maybe Baltimore Orioles, who were able to tie intricate knots, and that birds had schools and all kinds of things. Well, TR was in the White House. I guess he was going through kind of a tough time and he wanted to sort of divert himself. So he plunged into this battle. He knew it was wrong. Presidents are not supposed to attack individual Americans, but he took on these writers. And his problem with him, it was perfectly all right, he said, if they told stories and said they were stories. Well, he loved the Jungle Books and Mowgli, but the idea of telling as truth these stories, that's what he objected to in others. So that was one of the battles. I'll tell you about one other battle, which is called the Lumpers and the Splitters. I love the name. And here we bring Seahawk Merriam back again. There he is on the right with the white jacket, TR behind him. And Merriam, as I say, was probably the leading naturalist of the time. And he'd gotten into his heads that we ought to have, species designations should be very tightly defined. And so he was willing to define as a separate species animals that to you and I might look like the same species on very small differences. And those were the splitters. They were splitting it up. And TR was not a splitter at all. He was for keeping the species definitions broader than they were. Once he commented, let's see what he said. He said, certain conservative instincts which are jarred when an old family friend is suddenly cut up into 11 brand new acquaintances. So he was against this, and this became rather a public battle. This is after TR's presidency. So TR continued on. He decided that he wanted to debate Merriam. And so there came an opportunity at the Cosmos Club when the Biological Society of Washington was holding a meeting. And so he volunteered to have a debate. And so it was announced, and the scientists loved it. They came in droves. They wanted to see this brash amateur take on the lead person on this subject of lumpers and splitters. And so they debated. The end result was TR, most of the professionals thought TR had gotten the worst of it. But in fact, in the long run, TR was probably right. Well, when this was all over, Merriam, who was a sharp guy and wanted to sort of create the peace, and he knew how to checkmate TR. So what he did, he knew TR really loved big game animals, particularly elk. And so what he did is he split a group of elk off up in the Northwest states and created a new species, and he called it Corvus, which was the genus name of elk, Corvus roosevelti. Well, TR was certainly loved that and was flattered. And so he accepted it graciously, and that battle came to an end. I forgot to put in there that when TR, I love this quote, when TR went in to debate Merriman at the Cosmos Club, his comment was he felt like an Airedale who had somehow walked into a convention of tomcats. Well, anyway, TR, let's go on to TR's next phase, which was in the West. And there, by the way, are elk horns, showing how much he liked them. TR was a very careful observer and of nature. So he wrote a number of books when he was out there, but they're mostly about, much of them about his hunting experiences, but they weren't the typical bullets and blood books. They had a great deal more about the environment and the life histories of the animals and how they behaved. And so his books were not only, as I say, hunting books, were admired by scientists who saw them as almost a professional study of the large American game animals. This was really important to him. So two reasons why we should, his experiences in the West were important for as far as his environmental production was concerned, was one, this large game animals, and the other, even more important, he began to observe what was happening to the animals at the time and to the environment. Now you have to understand that in around 1880, 1890, almost all Americans believed that our natural resources were endless, and there was no way we could run out of them. And that not only the forests, but all the animals, there was just so many of them, we shouldn't worry about it. And TR, from his Western experience, realized that this was not true. First of all, he began to see the disappearance of the animals, and you will say seeing these elk horns, that maybe he was part of it, but he saw the disappearance of the animals, and then he saw the destruction of the land that was happening because of forestation and careless mining and all kinds of erosion. And he saw that this was a serious problem. So when he came back for the West, he was beginning to think about what he could do about this. And he recognized that one of the major problems was he had to educate Americans to understand this. If they were going to make any headway, they had to change the mindset that our resources were endless. So when he got back to New York, he established an organization called the Boone and Crocket Club. It was created in his living room. It was one of the first sort of environmental, if you will, organizations. And it was made up of a number of wealthy hunters, scientists, and politicians, with the idea of trying to get Americans to pay attention to their natural resources. It was kind of the climate change era of there are many similarities between the two. So one of the things they thought of is that it's important to get Americans to actually see the whatever they could of our natural resources. And so he encouraged them to travel and things like that. But he also thought an important role could be played by zoos. And so the Boone and Crocket Club got behind the development of zoos. And the first one they focused on was the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., which they helped establish. Here's a very early photograph of that zoo. There's obviously a buffalo and what I'm sure are a bunch of school children with their teachers. And this was a chance for them to see what we had before it was gone. TR was very concerned about this. So they created the zoo. They also created, and by the way, you should go to the National Zoo if you haven't been there. They also created what's known as the Bronx Zoo, which is another wonderful institution that definitely is worth a visit. So that was one of his aspects. Next, let's go here. Next concern they had was was Yellowstone. Now, Yellowstone was a park. There were 5 parks created about this time. The problem was that Congress created these parks, but they didn't create any kind of infrastructure to manage the parks or control the rules. So it might as well have not have done it. And this was when TR began to realize how important it was not just to create things, and not just what he was thinking about with the zoos, of getting people behind his ideas, but also the enforcement of it. And what was happening in Yellowstone, here's an example. People were starting to flock there. They first showed up in these little carriages, sort of the equivalent of a bus these days. And then the railroads appeared and put in spur lines. And of course, an infrastructure had to be built for these tourists. And so willy-nilly hotels and all kinds of other enormous towns were being created. And perhaps the most terrible thing that was happening is market hunting. In those days, it was legal to sell wild game in restaurants or butcher shops across the country, and they were very popular. And so hunters quickly learned, market hunters as they were called, they didn't care anything about the chase or anything about fair. They did whatever they could to slaughter as many of these animals. And of course, they didn't have to do anything that you would with cows, of raising them and controlling them. So they were devastating, and they were perhaps the major reason for the large animals going down. So they wanted to do something about the parks. And TR actually visited in 1890. They began to get into the fight of what to do. Now, the other thing they were interested in, of course, was big game. And here are some bronzes, wonderful bronzes, 4 of the big game. By the way, if any of you want to give me a gift, I'll be delighted to accept a bronze gift. But TR noted, he said, a beetle will be around forever. So they don't really need the kind of major conservation effort at the moment. What's needed is the big game animals, because they could soon be gone. Now, the Boone and Crocket Club, after all, they were hunters and all, and it wasn't all about serious things. I love it. I'd love a bottle of that. And so they had good times at it too. Now let's go to TR as governor of New York. TR had come back from his exploits in Cuba and San Juan Hill and all that. And when he arrived back in the United States, he found himself really the most famous and popular American in the country, pretty much. And the Republican Party, which was run by a guy named Thomas Platt in New York, needed a gubernatorial candidate. They didn't have anybody that could win. And so they thought about asking TR to run. Now, Platt, who was the party boss, he'd been a senator and a congressman, he was a lawyer and all sorts of things, but basically he ran the Republican Party. He was known as the easy boss. He ran the Republican Party in New York. Now, he's a little nervous about picking TR because he knew TR was probably uncontrollable. But on the other hand, I guess he figured that it was better to have an uncontrollable governor than a Democratic governor in the House. So they put up TR, and he won. And this gave TR a whole new platform. Well, first of all, they had to work out a relationship between Platt and TR. And the relationship was quite interesting. It sort of worked, not in general. There's a whole lot of nuances that I don't have time to go into. But basically, Platt wanted to be able to use his power as party boss to do all kinds of things that would increase the flow of money into the coffers of the Republican Party and Republican elected people. And so he was concerned about things like the streetlight concession in New York City, which if he could give to supporters, he could get big support for the Republican Party in exchange. TR was much more interested in environmental and longer term things. And so what TR wanted was, for example, the dealing with issues like the Palisades. Here are the Palisades right across from New York. They were about to be ruined, and he wanted to save them for New Yorkers forever. And there were other things, particularly the Adirondacks and Watkin Glens, all kinds of issues like that, and issues about pollution and fish and so on. And so the deal I kind of struck was that TR let Platt get some of his nefarious things, and Platt let TR get these sorts of things. And I think you'll agree with me that who cares about streetlights in New York now? What we do have are these longer term things that TR was able to achieve. So now let's go on to another issue during his gubernatorial years, and it's another war. It's called the Feather Wars. And what it was in those days is women wanted to buy hats that were adorned with bird feathers and even whole carcasses of birds. You can see bird carcasses there. A scientist did women wore hats whenever they went out in those days. And somebody did a count in New York and found that 75% of the hats he saw had bird parts on them. And some of these hats were amazing. These are real hats from the time. Imagine wearing that. If you think that's amazing, let's go to the ridiculous. The problem with this, and not with that one particularly, but the problem with the others was that in order to supply the feathers and the carcasses, market hunters went to bird breeding grounds, and they wanted them during the breeding season because that's when they were in their best feathers. And they were slaughtering them by the millions for this hat business. Well, TR as governor of New York couldn't do anything about that because that was out of the state. But what he figured, and this was sort of an example of how TR dealt with these things, if he could pass a law that made it illegal for hats to have these parts on them, that would be as good, or almost as good, as strangling, of stopping the slaughter itself. So he got a law passed that way that did that. And then he realized that enforcement was really important. So he enlisted the help of a bunch of scientists, including Frank Chapman, who was an American Museum of Natural History guy, to go around incognito or undercover to the milliners, in other words, the hat manufacturers. And when they found a hat manufacturer that was still making hats from bird parts, report it to TR, and TR would send the state troopers. And so at least he began to deal with this problem. And he also, of course, focused on many other issues: enforcement of game laws, the erosion and fire control, river pollution, and protection of fish in the Hudson. That was a big business in the Hudson River. This was a nod to his uncle, RBR. Anyway, now let's go to the presidency and what he was able to achieve. Now, this is a huge topic, and I'll only be able to deal with some of it. But let's start. Remember, I said that Americans really didn't care about the environment issue. And so he started in his effort as president to try to get Congress to do something about it. And he would lecture them. Now, here's a typical kind of congressman. He would lecture with them about how they ought to do it and posterity and what their obligations were. And one old congressman, after he'd given a number of speeches like this, was heard to mutter, "What?" He said, "What has posterity ever done for me?" Well, when TR, he figured out that was the attitude. He wasn't going to get anywhere with Congress because they were controlled by big business. They were controlled by the interests who were the market hunters or who wanted to put hotels in Yellowstone and so on. So he realized that the way to make this happen was to get the people behind him. And he started a whole series of efforts of going out and talking to people. And that's a whole nother story. But he did whistle stop, huge rounds of the country, talking to thousands and thousands and thousands of people and hammering away at the importance of this and the importance of saving the environment for their children and their children's children. And he managed to build up enough of a push back on Congress that they started doing what he wanted to do. Now, birds was his first love, and so I'll tell you first a couple of cute stories about birds. Here's TR's cabinet, and one day they were waiting for him to come in. It was, the usual series of major things, and in rushes TR, clearly extremely agitated. And they're thinking to themselves, "Oh my God, what terrible national disaster has happened that we need to to focus on. And TR, when he calmed down a little bit, waved a feather at them and said, "This is the earliest in the year that I've ever seen a Virginia warbler on the White House grounds." They all heaved a sigh of relief. I'll tell you another story, which I think is quite interesting. It has to do with pine knot. There was no Camp David then, and so TR's wife bought this little cabin. It's in very rural Virginia, sort of not all that far from Charlottesville. And they would go down there on the weekends. It was totally unimproved. I know you can't see that very well. They did nothing to it. There is the inside. It had no running water, or electricity, or anything. It was very permanent. But TR loved it, and so did his wife, Edith. He had to carry the water. There was no running water. Well, while he was down there one weekend, he saw this bird. And this is a passenger pigeon. Now, a little about the history of the passenger pigeons. Passenger pigeons was the United States' most populous bird, and maybe the most populous bird in the world. In the early 1800s, there were huge flocks of them. One person recorded that for 3 solid days, a flock of passenger pigeons flew overhead. And so they were everywhere, and they were extraordinary. But the market hunters got to them. They were good to eat. And by the late 1890s, they had disappeared. And they'd last been seen in the wild, maybe 10 years before this event, when TR was down at Pine Knot, and he saw a little flock of them. Now, TR knew passenger pigeons. When he was a child, he had shot and stuffed them. He knew them very well. And he also knew that the only bird they could be confused with would be the mourning dove. And he'd seen mourning doves in the area. So he knew he'd seen a small flock of passenger pigeons, which nobody else had recorded for something like 10 years. He even checked with some neighbors and found another person who saw them. But he didn't want to go public with it because it just didn't need another controversy at the time. So he only told some of his scientist friends about it. And later in his life, he did say this. It caused a stir even then. But think of it, it is quite possible that the last person to see a passenger pigeon in the wild was the President of the United States. So sticking with birds, when TR was in the White House, market hunting was still going on, plumage hunting for hats. And there was a little island called Pelican Island in the Indian River in the east coast of Florida. It's only 3 acres, but it was a major rookery where some, 18, 20 species of birds bred. And the market hunters would go in there during breeding season and wipe them out. Well, a couple of scientists came into the White House and asked TR, told him about the plight here and asked TR if he could do anything about it. And the Pelican Island was federal land. So TR turned to one of his aides and said, is there any law that prevents me from making a federal bird preserve? And the bemused aide, nobody had ever heard of a bird preserve, there was no such thing, had to say, no, sir. So he said, thus I declare, and it became the first bird preserve, which went on to become the whole bird kind of reservations that we've done. Nowadays, the largest bird reserve in the country, by the way, there are 51 of them now. And the largest one in the country is 2,500 square miles. It's larger than Connecticut. So, and by the way, at the end of his service in the White House, there was a woman named Lucy Maynard, who was a birder in Washington, wrote books, asked him to tell her some of the birds he'd seen on the White House grounds. And he said, I'll do better than that. I'll list them. And he gave her a couple of days later, a list of almost 100 birds that he'd seen. Now, there are many other areas I could go in, land reclamation and the whole large mammal, the whole thing. TR environmental efforts were enormous. In fact, Douglas Brinkley has written a book. This is the longest single book on TR, and it's about his environmental efforts. It's almost 1,000 pages. But I'm going to focus on parks and forests here. There was an enormous debate going on in TR when TR was in the White House between 2 factions led by 2 men. One of them was Muir, on the left, John Muir. The other was Gifford Pinchot on the right, and they represented radically different viewpoints. Muir wanted to keep the wild lands the government had as wilderness, and Muir saw that we had these huge resources and that the government lands ought to be managed sustainably, we would call it now. Then they called it wise use, but managed for the country needed those resources. And if it were mining and destructive, it should be done in a way that was the least damaging. So they had enormous followings, and they were at each other's throats, and they each believed that they had the answer. Now, TR, who knew them both well, recognized that they were both right and they were both wrong. We needed wilderness land, but we also needed sustainable use land. And so out of this came two agencies. The wilderness land is the U.S. Park Service, and the sustainable use land is the U.S. Forest Service. A lot of people don't know the difference, but they're very different and have very different purposes. Now, TR could make a national forest by congressional, the signing of a pen, but the parks he couldn't make. And so let's start with parks. Let's start with the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon was not a national monument, a national park, and TR wanted it to be, and I think appropriately we would all agree it's one of the great things here. But the Congress didn't want to do it. They were the ones that had to do it. Congress didn't want to do it because business people had their interest. And so TR began this fight. And here you see a picture of the first automobile, apparently, to go to the Grand Canyon. And that totally insane idiot sitting there, my palms sweat just looking at the guy. And so TR kept trying to get Congress to do something about it. They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. And finally, TR said, well, I can, by executive order, make it a national monuments, and I can make game preserves. So I'm going to make the side a national monument and the bottom a game preserve. Congress won't be able to do anything, and they'll come to the senses. And so he did. And eventually they did, of course, and made it in 1919 a national park. Let's talk a little about forests. So here are the national forests in the United States today. And I'm going to focus on one little corner, this top left corner where Idaho, Washington, Oregon are. And here's the story. It was towards the end of TR's presidency. And those state people, the politicians in the state knew that TR was just about to make a whole bunch of forests in there, and they didn't want it. They wanted to clear cut, business again was controlled here. And so what they did is they got their congressmen and senators to tack on to a major appropriations bill. It was an agricultural bill, but it absolutely had to be signed. So they tacked onto it a rider that the president could not make any more national forests in those three states. And so it passed Congress and went over to be signed by the president. They thought they'd checkmated him. But TR recognized he had some 10 or 12 days or whatever it was to sign the bill. So he called in Gifford Pinchot, and they spread it around on the floor of the executive office maps of these three states and started outlining forests. And the day he had to sign the bill, he signed 51 new national forests in those states. And then he signed the bill. And that wasn't anything Congress could do. He got a lot of pleasure out of that. He said Congress was doing handstands, but there wasn't anything they could do about it. And he, to this day, those states, that state has the highest percentage of forest land in the country. So during today, today the Park Service has about 85 million acres of land, and the Forest Service has about 193 million acres. It's astonishing that so much of it is wilderness, that, a quarter of it or so is wilderness. It was an achievement that he did, he was very successful at. So let's currently look at it. Currently, there's more than 400 million acres of federal land, which is preserved in the lower 48. 400 million acres, and better than half of those, you see them there today in red, better than half of those were saved by TR personally as president, an enormous achievement. To summarize his achievements, he created 21 reclamation projects, 150 national forests, 51 bird preserves, 21 game reserves, 18 national monuments, and 5 national parks, including Crater Lake, Wind Canyon, and Mesa Verde, and of course, eventually the Grand Canyon. The largest park in the country is 13.2 park. This is park, not forest. 13.2 million acres, which makes it larger than Maryland. And in the lower 48, the largest is Death Valley, which is 3.4 million. The largest forest in the country, interestingly, is smaller. It's in Nevada. It's 6 million acres, but it's the size of Vermont. Anyway, TR's achievement was putting away 230 million acres of land, which is the equivalent of the 15 states. It's basically 1 out of 7 acres of land. An amazing achievement. TR lamented later in his life that he could never be counted as a great president because great presidents had wars. Washington, Lincoln, later FDR are generally considered the 3 greatest presidents. And he said he could never be a great president because he didn't have a war. Well, he did not have a war. In fact, TR was the only president in the 20th century where no US soldier fired at anyone else in an incident of TR's making. In any case, but, he is generally listed as one of the top 4 presidents, in spite of the fact he didn't have a war, because he had a war of kind. It was a conservation war. And we can say you never win the conservation war, but he certainly advanced it a great deal. So I think we have a lot to be thankful for, that there was no war during TR's time. Now, before I turn it, that's the end of my talk. But before I turn it over to questions, we're going to have a little bit of, 3 PSAs, public service announcements, and 1 ad. So first, let me say that the next session will be TR and Leadership. Mark your calendars, Tuesday, April 20th at noon. So go to roosevelt.liu.edu for that, for registration and for past performance. And let's keep the registrations up there at the 900 number. At least I'd like it. Second, I want to put in a plug for the Roosevelt School. Rita mentioned that earlier. We will be starting in September. It will be a school degree granting school focusing on international relations and public policy. It's founded with 3 icons, the 3 Roosevelts, Eleanor, FDR, and TR, and will cover areas of interest to them. Not only will it teach students, it will also have a major role in trying to further various areas that was of interest to these 3 Roosevelts, everything from conservation, international relations, civil rights, and human rights. And so we will be having our first convention or symposium this fall. It will be at Tuesday, let's see, when will it be? It's going to be in October 20th and 21st. And the third thing I want to mention is the Society of Presidential Descendants, which I have established. Believe it or not, there was no organization for presidential descendants. So this will be a platform for presidential descendants to get together, but it's also going to focus, one of its main focuses will be on trying to reinstitute civic education in America and the education of our population on civics. And one of the first things it's going to do is going to have an award for the best book on presidential leadership. And that will be announced. There will be a dinner. It'll be at the University Club in New York. You're all invited, October 23rd, Saturday, where it'll be announced. And finally, the ad. A lot of people are involved in putting together these talks, Tales of TR. And Long Island University has been very generous about providing the infrastructure that's needed to do this. But if we want to continue it, I'm going to have to get some money, and I don't want to charge. We've been pleased that we have not charged for this. But so I would plead to you that if you enjoy these and you want to see them continue, go to our website, roosevelt.liu.edu, and you will see a donate button. And donate whatever you want. I mean, I hope you feel like when you go into museums these days and they have voluntary donations, I hope you'll go and help us out so we can continue to do this. So on that note, those 4 ads, Rita, I'm ready for the questions.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Professor Roosevelt. So the first question that we have is from Jay in Huntington, New York. What do you think Theodore Roosevelt's views would be on big game hunting in today's world?
That's a very good question, Jay. The Boone and Crocket Club is still around and it's still concerned with these things. I think, first of all, he'd be proud at how well we've done preserving game and more importantly, their environments, so that hunting can be a sport available to Americans, not just the rich, but all. And I think he would be very pleased where we are. I think what he wouldn't be pleased at is these canned hunts that are cropping up here and there, where the animals are penned in and many exotic animals are brought from Africa and elsewhere for hunters, quote unquote. I don't consider them hunters, who go into basically a pen and shoot an animal. I think that this has anything to do with hunting. That would have outraged TR. He believes that the actual killing is the least of it. The biggest thing is to get people out, the exercise, the beautiful country, the beautiful animals. And to the extent that that is encouraged in the United States, I think he'd be very pleased. And hunting is still going strong, although they are suffering somewhat. But new groups are being brought in. A lot more women are hunters now. So anyway, you could see that I'm in favor of this, and I think TR would be too. I don't generally like to sort of say what TR would say about now because it's a different time, but this issue is pretty much the same. So I feel fairly comfortable with that. Next.
This is from Rick, who's the former director of the Maryland Park Service. He's asking the movement about the movement regarding the system of state forests and parks throughout the United States. Can you describe how President Roosevelt perhaps influenced the state park movement?
Good, Rick. Thank you. And thank you, Rick, for all, you're retired, I guess, but all you did before. It's very important. TR recognized the importance of state involvement. After all, he'd been governor of New York and he was very concerned about various New York state, particularly the Adirondacks, but as I said, many others there as well. TR thought that the federal government could show the way, but the major work could be done by the states. And so at the end of his presidency, he announced a conference of state conservation people and gathered them all at the White House from all the states. And a big conference which discussed how they could take the ideas that had been developed by the federal government and the thoughts and concerns and lessons learned and translate it to the states. And it was very successful. And I'm sorry, I don't know, I should have looked up, maybe I will later, of the percentage of state parks and forests and the like compared to others. It also spawned a whole group of private exercises in this, private forests, private park-like situations. And there's quite a lot of land in that. For example, Harvard, most people don't know this, but Harvard has a forestry school. And as part of that, they own forests that they use for research purposes, but also as conservation. So there are all kinds of elements. If this is going to work, and it is starting to work, it's a perpetual battle. We have to fight it, continue fighting it. But to work, everybody has to be involved. And the states have played a huge role and continue to.
Thank you. This is from Peggy. She asks, how do you reconcile TR's passion for conservation with his trophy hunting? Specimens, yeah. I just want to give the part two. The specimens at Natural History is one thing, but the mountain animals at Sagamore Hill is very jarring to many of us who go and visit.
This is a very hot button issue, and I don't want to go into it too much here. I will say hunters have been a major player in the conservation effort in this country uh, through starting with the Boone and Crocket Club. And in many ways, they have done more than many of the other organizations. So some of these enormous organizations like the Elk Foundation, I think it's called, have over 150,000 members, supply all kinds of money to support conservation efforts. And of course, state fish and game licenses support tremendous amounts. It's hard to explain to people why hunters, a lot of people seem to think that hunters are have tails and horns and so on. And I'm not the one to tell you. A great writer wrote a book, and part of which he called The Scandal of the Hunter Conservationist. Anyway, hunters, there are plenty of bad hunters, but most hunters are very strong environmentalists and are concerned about it and believe that hunting is a natural thing. I mean, after all, every hamburger you eat comes from an animal that's been slaughtered. And after all, and that may sound a little like an apologist, but it's true, every wild animal faces a grim end. Where, they don't die in bed of old age. They usually get devoured by a predator. And if you don't control, I live on the vineyard, and we have a deer problem there. And even many hunting hunters are beginning to think that more attention should be paid to this problem. It's the hunters that control the deer. And nobody has come up with a really successful other way of doing it, although maybe it's possible. And if you don't control the animals, then they die of starvation, and the end of their life is much worse at starvation. So I know I'm not making a very good argument for it, but it's hard to describe.
Okay, we have room for one more question. And then I just want to remind everybody that a lot of the answers to these questions are available on our website, roosevelt.liu.edu. There is a section called Tweed's Corner, and you'll be able to see answers to the most frequently asked questions. So I'll be providing these questions to Professor Roosevelt, and he'll be answering them, and eventually they'll be put up on our website. But I do have one last question to pose before we end today. Professor Roosevelt, in terms of environmental conservation, did Theodore Roosevelt's children follow in his footsteps?
Well, there's a good question. Yes, they did. And also their great-grandchildren, I might add, I being one of them. I can tell you most about my grandfather because I've spent a lot of my early life with him. And he very much passed on to me what he had learned from his father about conservation, also about hunting. And it was a strong advocate, as were the other children, some more than others. And as you go down in the generations, it seems it's a family tradition. I think many family members have been involved in various ways in the conservation effort. For example, I have a cousin, Simon Roosevelt, who's a major player in this area. And I've done some, and others have. And it's gone down to my son, and I hope to my first grandchild, who's just a little girl, who's just over a year old. I will pass it on to her when I get a chance. So I want to thank you all for coming. I think I had a lot of fun. I hope you did. There's a lot more to this subject. You might want to read Wilderness Warrior, because but it's a tome. It's really heavy. There's a wonderful book I like. It's not that easy to find. It's called T.R. the Naturalist by Cutright. And it's only a few hundred pages. I highly recommend that book. So anyway, thank you all. I've really enjoyed it. I'm really looking forward to seeing you next month, and I better go and get to work on that talk.